Depending upon the denomination, baptism is often thought of as an ordinance. That's the way Baptists believe. It is a rite or a ritual observed by the church that was commanded by Jesus. So we practice the ordinance of baptism. We practice the ordinance of the Lord's Supper, for instance. But it is also in many ways by many considered a sacrament. And a sacrament, some Christian traditions will use that terminology. That is the idea of it is a means to receive the grace of God through what is otherwise would be considered a ritual. Well, Paul uses baptism as a symbolic representation of death in Romans chapter 6. I mentioned this briefly in my sermon on Sunday, but I want to expand just a little bit. Now, before I do, I want to make sure that we understand that Paul does not belabor the point about baptism in Romans chapter 6. Baptism is not his central argument. Baptism by water is not his central argument in any way, shape, or form. However, the people of Rome, the people that Paul was writing to, would have understood the representation of being baptized in water. But for us to understand that to have that same kind of understanding that his initial readers did, we need to put ourselves into their shoes and dispel a couple of ideas. First, baptism in the Bible is immersive. Now, I realize that there's a lot of faith traditions that do not immerse or submerge people. They don't put people underwater. As some would say, they don't dunk them, right? They just sprinkle on a head, and that is considered baptism. Now, I would suggest that in any form of baptism that someone would allow, there are people that are absolutely scared to death of water. There are people who, for instance, to get to our baptistry, you have to go up steps. If they are unable to walk up steps, they could not get in to be dunked. So I understand that exceptions can be made, but biblically, baptism, the Greek word baptizo, means to be immersed. It means to be submerged in water. And this is the idea that Paul is making sure that the people understand as he's writing to them in the book of Romans. Now, in our culture, we use this word, baptism, to relate to a religious moment or a ceremony of some sort. But in the first century, that would have been a very difficult understanding. It was a religious moment. But this word was commonly used. We only use it pretty much in the church world. Oh, maybe we say, well, he's baptized into fire. But even baptized into fire has the idea of death. And that is what Paul is going for when he uses this terminology of baptism. See, to be baptized was to die, primarily death, to be submerged in water to the point of death, to be destroyed by water in some way. And so, for instance, I mentioned on Sunday, if someone were to be swimming in the lake or swimming in a river or whatever and drowned, they were considered to have baptized. They were baptized. They drowned. They died. Likewise, if a ship were to sink in the water, that ship was baptized. It went under water. It is sunk. It is done. Presumably, as I mentioned again on Sunday, was the people that were on board that ship were also baptized. They were dead. Because of the water, because of going under the water, they were dead. So again, if we're baptizing somebody in the tank up behind me, that is not the intention. We're doing this as a religious ceremony, as an ordinance, because Jesus said, go and baptize. So we baptize, but we bring people back up out of the water. But this idea of death, for the first century reader or listener, most likely, was the intent that they would have heard. The word would have intended something very different than what we think. But remember, it's not the how, even though it was being submerged, it was what it represented. It was the death aspect of this. So Paul is using this term in that way right here. People were baptized into death. They died, and when you die, you are buried. Of course, Jesus died on a cross, so our type of death is not the same in that regard, but we must die to ourselves. We must die to our desires. And again, the word baptism, to a first century hearer, somebody who heard these words, would have understood that. Well, that leads me to the second idea that I want to point out. Because Jesus did not remain dead. And those who are baptized into Jesus' death do not remain dead either. We are born again, and baptism is a symbol of this. But the word that we use for raised, when we say raised up from the water, we might also say raised up from the grave. In our culture today, we often think of that as somebody being buried 6 foot underground. There is a hole in the ground, a coffin is placed in the ground, and the dirt covers that. And so to be raised is to be raised up literally from 6 feet under until you are back on the earth. Now, we could also say that there is a raising from a horizontal position to a vertical position. That would be true too. And that is indeed what Jesus did. But we have to understand that when Paul is writing about being raised up with Jesus, he's not talking about coming 6 feet from under the earth, because Paul really had no understanding of being buried 6 feet under the earth. Most people in that day were either buried in a hillside, a hole dug into the hillside, maybe a marker put there, or more likely into a cave or a large cutout into the side of a hill. So maybe a little cutout because they couldn't afford much, or maybe you excavated some area to be built, or maybe you could actually have a cave. So when Paul is talking about being raised from the dead, he's not talking about coming up out of the ground. He's talking about coming out of death into life. And again, similarities, but not exactly the same. These are some of the things that you might say, well, it really doesn't matter. And in many ways, I would agree it doesn't. But we get some ideas in our mind about what we think is right, and we try to project that onto the Bible, and they would have had no understanding of what we mean. For instance, if you talk to a child about marrying, or giving birth to Jesus, and the cows around, many children will still have the idea of, well, they were in a hospital and somehow they let animals into the hospital room. That's obviously not what is meant, but we, at least in a modern society, many of the births that we have take place in a hospital, so we project that kind of understanding into the scripture. So yes, a person is raised up, and yes, a person is baptized into death, and that metaphor is what Paul is ultimately trying to get us to understand, trying to get his first readers to understand as well. It is not how those things that is done. Maybe we should start that again. It is not how those things are done that is most important. It is that they are done. Notice that Paul did not say that we died with Christ in baptism. It is not our baptism that saves us. He says we died with Christ through baptism. It is a representation. It is the instrument through which we are buried with him. And that death to ourselves, to our sin, and then being raised back up is what ultimately gives opportunity that we might walk in newness of life. And that walk is learning to walk with him and to walk in him, which is the subject of tomorrow's video.